Welcome to Profits Through Podcasting, the show for entrepreneurs with podcasts who want to monetize by generating leads and profits for their business from podcasting. I'm your host, Joel Oliver, CEO of East Coast Studio. Do you dream of making a full-time living through podcasting? Today's guest has done that, although it wasn't his original plan when starting out. Greg Myers launched the Leaders in Payments podcast a number of years back and just surpassed 300 episodes published. The podcast generates a substantial amount of revenue through sponsorships, plus it led Greg to start his own podcast production company, Podcast 609, for businesses in the payments and fintech space. While consulting work in his space originally helped springboard his success in podcasting, Greg was actually able to stop doing that work, and now the majority of his income is tied back to podcasting in one way or another. Greg will share how he's managed to keep going for 300 episodes and turn all this into a viable business, some unique factors to keep in mind when working with B2B podcasts, and how podcasting has opened countless doors that led to the growth of his business. So Greg, we've got a lot to unpack today because you don't just host a single podcast, you're actually involved with a number of podcasts, and that's through a business that you have called Podcast 609. You've got a lot of knowledge when it comes to podcasting as part of a marketing and business strategy, specifically in terms of B2B podcasting, so we'll focus on that today. And we can also chat a bit about the production company because I think that's a feasible business model for the right people as well. So it's going to be interesting to hear how you've done that. So let's just take this one step at a time to start with an idea of your journey. So we'll begin with the Leaders in Payments podcast. Let's hear about that, a brief history there. When did you first start? How many episodes do you have at this point? What's the Leaders in Payments podcast all about?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. But, just to give kind of a history. So I started in the payments industry. A lot of people bucket payments and fintech together. I started in the industry almost 20 years ago, always on the marketing side. I've been a B2B marketer my entire career. And basically after, being in the corporate world, working for some of the biggest payments companies in the world, decided to go out on my own doing basically fractional CMO type work. And it was between Christmas and New Year's of 2019, I just had this epiphany. I was like, there's no podcast that focuses on CEOs and founders of payments and fintech companies to give them a platform to tell their story. So I reached out to 10 CEOs that I knew from being in the industry, and 8 of them were like, sure, I'll be on the show. So I was like, well, crap, now I got to figure out how to do a podcast. So it took me a month or so, but that was sort of the premise of it. And really, it's what has been the foundation of the show from the very beginning. Honestly, had no idea I'd still be doing it almost 5 years later, but here we are.
Right, and it's what is it? You just hit or about to hit 300 episodes?
Yeah, just went over. In fact, this week we will launch our 305th episode. Right. Started in late January of 2020, so right before the pandemic. But yeah, just have been doing 1 to 2, sometimes even 3 episodes a week based on kind of demand. But over a little over 300 episodes.
Okay, so you, if I get this right, you were doing basically consulting work, and then you introduced the podcast.
Yeah, I was fractional CMO for a couple of different companies in the space, and I've always had a love for podcasting. And being my background is marketing, so I kind of combined that marketing with payments with podcasting, and came up with the idea for a podcast that, going into it, really didn't know what to expect. Just felt like as a consultant, it would really help my network, right? It would really help me grow my consulting business. Just by being connected to these other thought leaders and CEOs and founders of payments and fintech companies. So I kind of went into it just with that premise of, hey, this is a networking thing. I really didn't know that it would end up being a business, a viable business. It was more of a way to support what I was doing at the time.
Right. And so you mentioned those 10 people that you originally asked. I know you've asked a lot more people since then. Did you find that prior to having a podcast, networking was a little more challenging, or at least the podcast, once you had it, it kind of just opened the doors to make those connections a lot easier to meet new people?
Totally opened the door to those connections. I mean, I think because I had a background in the industry, I knew some of the original ones, very closely already, but the ones that I didn't know that I was able to get references to and then had them on the show. I mean, the thing about podcasting, it's not like you just jump on, you record, and then you're done, right? You've got a little talk at the beginning, you got a little talk at the end. You can bring up connections that you mutually have. You can talk about their company. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do to build a relationship with the guest that's on your show. And so it definitely helped build my network. I mean, tremendously. I've got other businesses that I think we're going to talk about later that are definitely connected to and driven by the fact that I made those connections. And the other thing, when you think about it, typically, you're not just, like in my case, I'm not just talking to the CEO. There's a marketing person or a comms person or a PR person that I'm also connecting with. So you're not building relationships with just one guest. Typically, it's, a couple of others. I mean, depending on what type of podcast you're doing. But in my case, I was able to connect with multiple people in a company, which just, again, broadened that network.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great thing to bring up. One of the topics I was speaking about recently is just getting momentum behind podcasting and the difference that I've seen between people who might do a few episodes and quit versus people who hang in there like you've done 300. You can't do 300 episodes of a podcast and not get benefits from it, like a giant network and, revenue or whatever else you're trying to pursue. Like 300 episodes in, that's a lot of people that you've spoken to. So that's a great accomplishment. So you started, that was kind of the first part of all of this. It was the Leaders in Payments podcast. At what point did the production company come in? Because first give us a brief overview of the company Podcast 609, what that does and when you decided to start that and why.
Yeah, so Podcast 609 is basically a content development, podcasting, production company. So we help B2B companies, and we're very focused on our space. So very focused on the payments and fintech ecosystem. But we help other B2B companies launch, maintain, grow their podcast. And I think the real demand came about 2 years ago. People started asking me, we're kind of interested in a podcast, for our business. And I was like, okay, I'm starting to hear there's a business opportunity here to take everything I've learned at that point from 2 years of doing podcasts and kind of rolling it together and creating, a business out of it. And really what I think the marketing teams needed was like a full solution, right? They didn't need just the editing part. They didn't need just, the recording part. They needed the strategy. Like, why should we do this? Who's our target audience? How many episodes do we do? What's the cadence? All those things that I've kind of learned just over time. And that knowledge and expertise is taking it to them. And then the other thing that we offer is basically a marketing package, right? So we tell them we're going to provide them, the blogs and the edited transcripts and the social media. So we do LinkedIn posts and the graphics. We do Twitter posts and the graphics. So we do all of that, package up all of that content for them and give it to them as well. So there's really, all of that strategy, launch, manage everything. And, over time, we've had more and more companies asking us, and we've started now in the last few months to really push it and promote it and try to grow that business. So really, I just tell people, hey, I'm in this space. I've been in it for 20 years. I've been podcasting for 4 years. I'm taking all that knowledge and creating this company that's going to help you launch your own podcast. And it's been well received. It's, people are scared. They don't think they have the time. They don't think they have the money. And, at the end of the day, it's such a great marketing tactic and tool in the B2B space that, that's kind of where the demand's coming from.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. I'm excited in a little bit. We're going to get into the B2B stuff and how that works in podcasting. So essentially you have a finance background in that space. You start the Leaders in Payments podcast. Then people start saying, hey, how do we do this? Like people in your network are wanting to do a podcast. And because you're in that niche, the payments and fintech, you're the guy to help them. This is interesting too, because I've kind of heard, and as the owner of a podcast production company, we're always looking for ways to get new clients. And I've ran into people that say, oh, people who aren't even associated with podcasting at all, they just maybe work on a computer, and people start asking them, could you help me do a podcast? And I think, well, how come you didn't seek out someone to do it? So it's funny, you are actually in that area, so it makes sense that they ask you. But you're just being there and existing and having both the knowledge of the podcast and then the niche that you're in, and they go, hey, how do we do this? And so you see a business opportunity there, and that's where that came from.
Yeah, I think the other part that maybe I didn't mention enough is it's really the making the connections with the marketing people that, if you're a modern day marketer, right, podcasting, even in the B2B world, is a tactic that a lot of companies are starting to use or have already started, right? So it's not like a foreign concept to these marketing people. And a lot of marketing, when I say marketing people, I mean the marketing department, they're looking for content. They're looking for thought leadership. They're looking for ways to get their message out in a different way than everybody else. So it's naturally a conversation, that I can have with them is like, hey, are you guys doing a podcast? Have you ever thought about doing a podcast? And, you get the answers from, oh my gosh, we don't have time. We're a 2-person department. We can't do it, to, hey, we've been thinking about it. And then that just starts the conversation. Or, there's some companies obviously in the industry that already have one. So I always say, hey, if we can do anything to help, let us know. But I think it's that kind of marketing team that we're really focused on going after that already has some interest and some demand just because they know about podcasting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is where being in a niche becomes very powerful, because if you happen to be a fintech company that's looking to do a podcast and you can look up who to help with launching a podcast, you're going to get endless results. But they find a guy like you who is actually in that space, and you help with the launch and all that stuff. Yeah, that's a big key to success in business, right? So
yeah,
and you grew that network and you position yourself in the right place. So that's great. So let's talk a bit about the monetization aspect, because that's what we want to do here on this podcast, is share how to effectively generate leads and profit for a business or revenue in some way through a podcast. So how does this look? The Leaders in Payments podcast, 300 episodes in, are you driving any leads from that podcast to the 609 business, or what's exactly going on there with the podcast specifically?
Yeah, so with the Leaders in Payments podcast, we have sponsorship opportunities, and we do a couple of different things, a couple of different ways we generate revenue. One is we do 3 special months throughout the year. So they're focused on, like, March is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Month, July is Women Leaders in Payments Month, and September is Financial Inclusion Month. So 3 areas within the payments ecosystem that I felt needed more awareness and visibility. And I think you could go across almost any industry and create 2 or 3 of those. So no matter what, your audience, no matter what sort of segment they're in, what business, what ecosystem they work in, I'm sure they can come up with those if that's a concept. And so we have people on the show and we have sponsorships. So last July, American Express sponsored Women Leaders in Payments Month. It's not pay to play. You don't have to pay to be on the show. But obviously that's one area we generate, revenue through sponsorships. And then we have other programs. People over time have come to us and said, hey, you've built this brand, you've built this network, you've built this audience. How do we leverage it, for our marketing? So we've done simple things. I'll just give 2 quick examples. Things like, if you had a research paper or a white paper and you wanted to amplify that content, we do like a 3-part mini-series about that content. Or we've done other things. We have something called the Pulse of Payments, which is a deeper dive into a topic. So instead of a CEO interview or a founder interview, it's more about a specific topic, and maybe it's 4 to 6 episodes about that topic. And then we've done things like, after the series, we'll create a white paper about all that content and a video, a short kind of animated 2-minute video. So it becomes thought leadership and content for that company. And then, of course, we have the traditional kind of 30-second ads that we insert into episodes as more of a branding, way to generate some awareness of your brand. We obviously have that, but we have these sort of standard packages that we promote and people can leverage on that. And again, it kind of goes back to the whole build the network thing, where I've been connected to the marketing teams by having their CEOs on the show. So then that gets me into the conversation around sponsorships. That gets me into the conversation, to your point. Yes, it generates leads to my Podcast 609 business because I'm talking to the marketing people and I tell them, I'm very upfront about it. It's like, hey, yes, I want your CEO to be on the show because you guys are, players in the space. But eventually, after we do that, let's talk about your other marketing needs. What content thought leadership needs do you have? And I'm very upfront about it and tell them, hey, I've got this podcast business that we help others. And it's usually a very natural conversation. I would say a few times I've been like completely shut down where they're not interested, but most of the time, people are willing to listen. And, that's how we drive leads through, not only do we drive revenue with the leaders in payments through the sponsorship, it also drives leads for the production side.
Great. Okay. I think you probably answered this, but just let's kind of get it, in a neat package here. So things like those mini series you mentioned, say a white paper, that's not something where someone just comes to you out of the blue and says, hey, how about we do this? Like this is kind of something that you offer. You're talking to the right people. And if that conversation happens, it's kind of something you can bring up where they can say, hey, Greg, what kind of thing could you do for us here? Like you have these conversations going because of this network you created. It's not like someone just stumbles across your website and says, hey, do this for us. Is that correct? Mostly?
Yeah, that's pretty fair statement. I mean, I tell people, hey, we can be creative and come up with new and different things, but I do have kind of, I hate to call it this, but it's basically a media kit, right? It has those standard packages. But a lot of times we've gone off script, so to speak, and we've created unique things that we've done that may be a combination of 2 or 3 parts of a package or whatever. But yeah, that's sort of, to your point, that building that network has allowed me to have those conversations. Rarely, if ever, do I have someone coming to me saying they want to promote something. I get them coming to me saying, we want to be on the show. And then that starts the ball rolling.
Got it. And so I know at the beginning you told us what you had been doing for work when you first started the podcast. Are you still doing that?
Yeah. So up until about 18 months ago, the consulting side really, helped, pay for and keep the business, the podcasting side going. But since then, I've been able to stop the podcast or stop the consulting and turn it over completely. So everything I do now is all about podcasting, from the leaders in payments, which is obviously we just talked about the sponsorship stuff, Podcast 609, which is the production side and the marketing side for podcasting. And then I've got a third revenue source, which is basically just a CEO network that I have about 20 members that pay an annual fee to be a part of this network. So those 3 lines of business today actually make more money than I was making consulting. So, it's great. Consulting was great. Again, it was a way to build a network and to connect with people and through the consulting, but definitely have a lot more fun doing the podcasting and the marketing stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's great to hear those stories that I assume this is kind of what you wanted. Maybe you get a little extra freedom here too. You're your own boss. So to kind of go through that journey and you could stop the consulting altogether to work on something that you've built. That's great. So for Leaders in Payments, this is a podcast. This is it. And that's a huge source of income there is just sponsorship. There's like, aside from Podcast 609, which is going to be it's not like a big business, let's say. It's for the right people. So for Leaders in Payments, you're just selling sponsorships, selling ads through there essentially, and the various things you described. That's great.
Yeah, and I kind of look at it as, using my background in marketing and using my background in the industry, I can help these companies, because often what happens is they're like, hey, we've got this content strategy and we're looking for better, different ways to distribute it. What I end up doing because of my strategic marketing background is I'm really giving them free consulting in order to convince them that they should use podcasting as a tactic or a tool. And so I think because of all of that, it works really well. And, oftentimes I'm suggesting, hey, what do you want to accomplish with this podcast? What content strategy do you have in place? Do you have one in place? Let's talk about it. So it ends up being consulting in a lot of ways around marketing, and it's in the space that I know and love. And so it's kind of like I said earlier, it's combining, my experience and knowledge and passion for marketing and for podcasting and for payments, and putting all 3 of those together to build sort of these 3 businesses that have, all are generating revenue.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. So we've got a bit about the podcast, the business side of things. We'll try to tie those together. Curious, so we were just talking about marketing. For you, how does the podcast, what role does it play in your overall marketing plan? Are you leaning on this quite heavily, or do you have other sources where you're generating interest and views from? Like, are you doing paid ads or anything else? Can you talk a bit about that?
So, yeah, I mean, just going back a little bit. So when I first started the podcast, I really was scratching and clawing to try to find guests to come on the show, right? Trying to build it up. And over time, at least in this industry, there are a lot of PR firms that represent CEOs and other businesses. So I went from where I had to go source guests all the time to where I never have to source guests anymore. I get pitched probably twice a day, without exaggerating, probably twice a day from PR firms that have clients in payments and fintech that are trying to, obviously that's their job as a PR firm, is to get CEOs and founders and others on the show. It's a double-edged sword because I do get a lot that aren't the right profile. So I have to kind of sort through those. But again, back to, I don't have to go source them. So they come to me and I have to figure out how to put the right ones on the show, who they should be, what's the cadence. So I'm not doing like competitive companies on episodes right next to each other. So I have to do a little bit of strategic thinking around that. But again, that PR company at the end of the day connects me with typically someone in marketing or comms or PR at the firm that I'm, interviewing. That gets me the lead that I need to sell these other things, right? To sell the sponsorships, to sell the Podcast 609 podcasting side. So I'm not having to go out and do paid ads and things like that. Now, having said that, stepping back and looking at the Podcast 609 business, I am looking at doing some other marketing. We've really amped up and designed our website. We're creating a lot more content for that side of the business. In fact, I just launched a new podcast called Podcast Pointers, and it's basically like a 5-minute podcast about one specific topic related to B2B podcasting, with the goal to kind of build myself as more of a thought leader in that space, again, focused on just payments and fintech. But eventually, I think once I can get some momentum going, I think I might try some things like paid ads and things like that. But today, I don't have to. But I want to get that Podcast 609 business really up and humming. And I think eventually I'll have to do some of that.
Got it. Yeah, that shift you mentioned there where you go from kind of having to do a lot of work yourself to try and get guests. It's like pulling teeth. And then you have that shift where, okay, now everyone's coming to me. That actually kind of gets easier. That doesn't come overnight. It takes a while to do. And like we talked about in the beginning, you're 300 episodes in. What would you say helped you continue along that path? Because we've seen numbers that a lot of people start a podcast and they just give up. How are you able to hang in there and get to 300, whether it was systems you put in place or a mentality, or what do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, once I started it and I connected to the CEOs that I was interviewing, and again, I use CEOs. It could be any type of guest. If it's sort of the industry that you're in or the network you're trying to build, as I continued to have those conversations that led to conversations outside of the podcast, right? So I built a relationship. I'm like, there's something here. It's like I'm building relationships with CEOs in this industry to where, like, if I email them, they respond, or if I call them, they answer, right? So I looked at it as, for my career, I need to do this. If I need to stop consulting and I need a job, I've just built a network with all of these high-level CEOs in this industry. It's got to be good for me. I had no idea that it would end up becoming this business. But, I'm thankful it did. So I think to me, it was more like, if I stop doing this, I'm not going to be building more relationships. So why not just keep going? And then, as I learned more and more about podcasting, it's marketing, right? I mean, that's what I'm doing and that's what I have a love for. And, I've been a B2B marketer my whole life. So it kind of just played right into what I loved. And then, like I said, the demand to have companies that want to launch their own started. And I was like, okay, now there's another business model here. And And then the way the CEO network started, one of those CEOs that I was interviewing said, "Hey, Greg, you're like well connected with all these CEOs. There's really not a network for us. What do you think about starting it?" So boom, there was an idea that came, actually from a CEO that I was talking to that I built a relationship with. So yeah, I mean, I think it's that, and it's just, I felt the value of it by doing it. And I just thought, hey, I just have to keep doing this and keep doing this. And, the next thing you know, when you reach, a couple hundred episodes and you start being known for it in the industry, there's no doubt I've already built a brand around the Leaders in Payments podcast and me personally. It's like you kind of get into it. It's one of those things you get addicted to and you just can't stop. And, and for your own career and your own business that, it's something that you're doing it for the right reasons and you're building a network and you're building a business around it. It's just, something that I just don't feel like I could stop.
Right. So you made the decision, you're going to commit to it. I'm going to start it. And you kept going. Even in the early days, let's say before some of that success was coming around, did you ever have an issue with momentum and keeping it going? Or was it just, no, I started this thing. It's just what I do now. And that was it.
Yeah, I really never, contemplated stopping it. I really didn't. I felt like I was getting so much value from making these connections with these, CEOs and founders that it just, and, the other thing was, a lot of it early on was during COVID, right? So I started in January 2020. COVID was like started in March of 2020. So it was like, gave me something to do during that time when there wasn't a lot going on in the business world. So, that was part of it too, is being able to continue doing it during COVID. But and it's a mentality thing. I mean, I think if you're doing something that's creating value, I don't know why you would stop.
Right. So maybe we touched on this a little bit because you've opened my eyes to maybe part of an answer of something I wanted to chat about. And that is, of course, the B2B side of things and perhaps how B2B podcasting differs between normal B2C or typical podcast listener. So I'm kind of thinking, who are the types of people that are listening to a B2B podcast? So, can you reach those people that easily? And I'm sure that, yes, there's people in the industry listening to your podcast, but then you've been telling us about how you've been doing this networking, and so you get it in with a marketing team and you get a lead and then you end up generating business that way. So if I'm going to ask you let's say the simple question of the difference between B2B podcasting versus normal podcasting, is that where a lot of it lies? It's the actual networking and the other stuff that you're doing behind the scenes, as opposed to just straight up who is listening, like who in a business is listening to the podcast. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that the difference in just a business having a podcast or thinking about it or whatever is, it's the strategy behind it, and I think that's what to me differs a lot in just, hey, I have an interest in dogs, I'm going to start a dog podcast. In a business, it's like we have a message and we want to get that message out to the world about what we do. How do you do that? And I tell people, think about podcasts against like things like a blog. You post a blog, you spend all that time and money writing it. You have no idea how many people read it. Now, you can look at your analytics and see how many people maybe went to the page or whatever. You don't know if anybody read it. The beauty of podcasting is you can see how many listeners you're getting. And you can grow that community over time, and by having those analytics. So to me, it's more like understanding the strategy. To me, it needs to be a very strategic, thought through, like how many episodes can you do? What's the cadence? Can you create this as, a part of your overall content strategy? That can, and some people are like, oh, well, we only do things in marketing that generate leads. Well, there's certainly ways to generate leads with a podcast, but it's also very thought leadership and very content marketing related. And I think people have to kind of weigh all those different things. It's not like, running Google ads and you see all the Google analytics and you can, attach tags to things and get leads and all that. It's different, but it's still possible to get leads from it. So I think you kind of have to go into it knowing what is your strategy, why are you doing podcasting as a B2B company, and who's your target audience, how are you targeting them, all that strategic stuff up front. I think you really have to, you have to think about and put the time and effort into it up front.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Okay, well, we'll get wrapped up shortly. A couple more questions. I would like to have a brief bit of insight here in case anybody else is feeling that a production company similar to yours might be something that they could do for their own business. So you mentioned that you kind of got the idea for this by people approaching you. So I guess that would be a good first sign that if there's demand in your circle is people are coming to ask you for help about it. But the fact that you had the podcast and then you were kind of a thought leader in that space, it sounds like those were the two big factors that led to that idea for you and then you getting it off the ground. What would be some quick insight or advice you'd have for someone else that would consider doing the same thing, like actually getting that company up and running and putting the systems together and the knowledge to actually be able to go and take people step by step through starting the podcast and then the ongoing production and creation and like the marketing that you mentioned? Give us some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, first of all, I think you have to have a passion for it, right? You have to really, be able to dig into the weeds. And before I ever launched, the Podcast 609 business, I started, like you said, I started getting some people that were interested. And I stepped back and said, okay, do I really want to go into this? And I did a lot of research on like who was out there already doing it. How did they position themselves? Was anyone doing it specifically for the space that I was in? I think all of those are things you have to think about. And for me, at least, I wanted it to be a part of my overall vision for the businesses that I had. I think if you look at it and say, oh, I just want it to be a side thing, I'm not sure that's a great strategy because, I mean, it as well as anyone, it's a lot of time and effort and you really have to understand it. And I think you have to, be able to help companies differentiate themselves. And that gets into the strategies part and the marketing part. But yeah, is it doable? Yes. Can anybody learn it? Of course. I just think that you have to have a passion for it and you have to, be able to add value. I think there's a lot of companies out there that can produce podcasts, but if you're not bringing the strategy to it, you're not helping them grow it and bringing the marketing. I mean, you're just another one of the, podcast production company. I think but you can differentiate yourself. You can be a thought leader and help those companies, drive business. But I think, again, I kind of go back to you have to want to do it. You have to have passion. Just because a couple of people say, would you help me do this, doesn't mean that you can form a business around it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we get that inquiry a lot. People, they don't just want a podcast. They want to know, well, how can we make sure that this brings us success? And so that marketing side. And then like we talked about, where you have that expertise specifically in their niche, that's a huge thing. Yeah. And it's not just like, hey, maybe I can make a quick few dollars this way. It's a big commitment.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And I think another difference probably as well is, or at least I know this would be true for me, you can do a podcast on your own. You've got some things running, maybe I don't know we'll talk about it in a second, but in terms of systems and organization and things like that, you might have some little things hacked together that work or some things in your head about how the process works. But now if someone's going to come pay you and say, hey, show us how to do it, what do we need to do? Well, maybe you didn't understand as quite as much as you thought you did, or there's probably a learning process, right? Of how do I actually communicate this to someone else and get it so that they're set up for success. It's not just I have a podcast, let me start a company, right? You really need to put some thought into that, as you said.
Yeah, I spot on. I mean, you have to do the research. You have to understand kind of the ins and outs of it. And I mean, as well as anyone, it's a lot of tedious work to do it well and to do it right. And I think luckily for me, the marketing side and the strategic side comes pretty naturally, especially within the payments and fintech space. So I think that part was kind of easy for me and may not be for others. I don't know, but I think that part was easy for me. But I think that, the building it, you have to have a passion for it. You have to want to do it. And then there are tools and techniques that I definitely learned, from doing the Leaders in Payments that I don't think I know help, the Podcast 609 business.
Mm-hmm, for sure. So one final question here. Give us a little insight on your team. How does everything look behind the scenes? Like, is it just you? Do you have any help? How are you making things run like a well-oiled machine in terms of both the podcast and the business? How does that look?
Yeah, so right now it's just me. I don't have other full-time employees, but I have a lot of help, right? I have, obviously, you do our production work. I think that's okay to disclose. You guys have since the beginning. So we've had a 4-year relationship that has been amazing. You guys do incredible work. So obviously I outsource all of that production aspect. And so just what does that mean? So like the intros and the outros, putting those together, not just for Leaders in Payments, but for our clients as well. And then I use other tools, like we create audiograms. So we have a tool that does that. I have a hosting company that I use that obviously distributes the podcasts out to all the directories. So I have tools. I have a copywriter. I use AI for some stuff. I never ever have posted anything straight from like Chat GPT. I've always, edited it in some way. So I have, a content person that helps me, write the content, think through content strategies for my businesses. I've used designers over time. Sometimes, I use simple tools like Canva if I have a template and I can just easily do that. But if it's a brand new design, like if we're doing podcast cover art or something, I'll outsource that. Outsource the voiceover if we're doing intros and outros with, hey, we need a British accent, whatever, definitely outsource that. So, a lot of the work that I do is preparing for the interviews, doing the interviews. I try to outsource what I can. Some of it is inexpensive to outsource these days. Some of it, the tools are so easy to use. I do some of it myself. So, definitely can't do it all myself. Maybe in the first year or so, I did a lot of it myself, but not these days. I'm just spread too thin to be able to do it all myself. That's for sure.
Right. And that's just an evolving thing with a business as you grow it further and take on more clients. Well, maybe you'll be able to do less and less of that, which is not a bad thing. And then, that'll change. But that's it. When you're in business, things are constantly changing. So that's great. I appreciate your time. So basically for you, people in the fintech and payment space, whether it's a business looking for potentially to team up and have your assistants create a podcast for them, or check out your Leaders in Payments podcast. And then the podcast pointers is the new one, right? That's what your offering is. So we'll make sure to link all that in the show notes. Is there anything I missed?
No, I think you got it all there. And, the Leaders in Payments and podcast pointers are out anywhere you get a podcast. Obviously, they're out there. You can find those easily. And then the websites, I'm sure you'll have all those in the show notes. But yeah, that pretty much covers everything.
Cool. Thanks, Greg. Well, I appreciate your time, and it's a pleasure to work together for quite a few years at this point, and wish you continued success.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And thanks for all your help over the years.
Join us again next time on Profits Through Podcasting for more tips on how to turn your podcast into a lead and revenue generation machine for your business. And if you're ready to let a team of professionals handle your entire podcast production workflow so you can focus on the most important tasks in your business, visit eastcoaststudio.com/apply.